Hi again, folks. We're going to continue with this lecture, this basic history of Africa. It's very basic, um, and but it's necessary in order to give you some background about what happened in the continent over thousands of years. And just to be clear, you're not going to be quizzed or examined on this information. I just want you to understand, have a basic understanding of what happened. It will be helpful for you in the long run as we go through these various assignments. And again, I don't expect you to be experts on the continent itself. So let's start here with a map of the world. This is the Mercator projection of the world, and it's the most common one that most people will see. And if you take a look closely at the map, here's Africa, by the way, right there. There's the continent of Africa. It is roughly the same size as Greenland up here. And if you know anything about Greenland and Africa, you know that these two are not nearly the same size as one another. In fact, Greenland here is bigger than Australia and even bigger than South America. The reason why Greenland on this map looks so huge is because it's essentially a flat projection of a sphere. The Earth is round, folks. Sorry to all you flat earthers out there. The Earth is round. So let's take a look at actually a different perspective of the world. This is the Peters projection. There's the Peters projection of the Earth. And as you see here, I'm going to move my face up here. As you see here, oh, that doesn't show Greenland. It actually makes, I should have checked that more thoroughly. But actually, Greenland is up here, and it is much smaller than the African continent. And as well, Australia gets enlarged to its proper size, and you'll see that all the countries or continents and countries are represented accurately in this particular depiction. This is the actual true size of Africa. And I think most people find this astonishing, that all these countries can fit inside of the African continent. And it gives you an idea of just how vast and huge the continent is. The entirety of China can fit into northern Africa. India can fit into East Africa, the Horn of Africa. And when you consider that these two are the most populated countries in the world, that gives you an idea how large the African continent is. But here we see Mexico squeezed into the western coast of Africa. All of Western Europe is in the central to northern part of Africa, as well as Eastern Europe is crammed into this section here. There's the United States. You can actually fit about 3 United States inside of the African continent. And here's Spain and Portugal, and this is Japan. So all those countries together can fit inside the African continent. And this is one of these stereotypes, the myths that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie mentions, as well as Robert Pipers, is that Africa is often considered a country when it's not. It's composed of, I believe, to this date, 54 countries reside within that continent that you see here. And it is vastly diverse. In northern Africa, for example, is a heavily Muslim population, so you're going to get that kind of influence in those regions. So if you know anything about, yes, Egypt is in Africa, right up here. If you know anything about Egypt, Morocco, Libya, you know that those are very heavily Muslim populated countries, and Islam is dominant in those countries. The further south you go, the more indigenous the Africans become, and it becomes a mixture of various cultures and religions throughout the continent. But my point is that it is a very diverse continent. And this is something that Ngozi Adichie mentions in the TED Talk, and this notion of the single story, that this stereotypical African can be representative of the entire continent, when that's obviously not the case. So Africa is considered the cradle of humankind, where humans originated and populated the rest of the country. Here you see that this is the Great Rift Valley, and it's essentially just a tear in eastern Africa. and created this rift in the continent. And as a result, it exposed a lot of these fossil remains of, in particular, this is one of the more famous discoveries in Xanthropus. She was also called Lucy, after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, because the anthropologists were listening to the Beatles at the time. Anyway, it is considered the birth of mankind, the cradle of humankind, I should say. Don't be sexist. If you believe in Pangea, and there's some evidence to suggest that this might be true. I mean, if you just look at the after image here, you can see how these kind of fit together as almost as puzzle pieces. But the theory is that all the continents were massed together into one landmass, and over the century, aeons, I don't know how you would, I'm not a geographer, but over thousands and thousands of millions of years, the continents began to spread apart. And as a result, and some of the evidence suggests that this might be true, because if the flora along the West African coast here is much more similar to the flora on the South American coast than it is to the flora on the eastern side. So that makes for some interesting evidence to suggest that yes, it was one landmass. And as these continents began to drift apart, around 130,000 years ago, humans began to disperse out of Africa, the first humans, and began to populate the rest of the world. So yes, folks, the possibility is that your distant ancestors were African. So in essence, we're all African. But around 100,000 years ago, they began to populate the Middle East, and then they moved eastward instead of northward. Why? It's colder up north. So they were going to stick to climates that they were more familiar with. And so they went down into Southeast Asia and into Australia about 40 to 60,000 years ago. And around the time they settled into Australia, they then began to settle into Europe and Russia, and then made their way over the Bering Strait into North America. And 20,000 years, excuse me, let me click the button. About 20,000 years ago, they populated North America, and then 13,000 years ago, finally settled into South America. So Africa has what we call a triple heritage. That is, they have three different types of, three different histories. And the first one is the indigenous African ethnic groups. That's the original inhabitants of the continent. And after their dispersal into other parts of the world, the first people to return to the continent were the Arabs, mainly as traders, and they brought Islam. And it had a significant influence on the continent and the people. And so you'll see that Africa, like other parts of the world, is heavily influenced by Islam and Arabic culture. And then the third history or heritage was the European colonizers. And that began in the 1600s, but really didn't accelerate until the 1800s, when Europeans began to look at the African continent as a prize, essentially. And we'll get into that in a second. So those are the three histories major histories that they have in the continent. And it was long believed that Africa essentially had no history. You're going to read in Achebe's essay that this Oxford professor declared at one point that Africa essentially didn't have a history, that there was nothing to the continent to be learned, and that is in fact not true. The Mali Empire existed around 1500, well before Europeans entered the continent. The Arab traders were already in the continent, but this is a book, actually. Look, right there. Sundiata, the Epic of Old Mali, and this chronicles this king here, who was the ruler of the Mali Empire. And when you think about Mexico being in this particular region, fitting into this region, that's a pretty huge empire that was obviously, must have been very sophisticated in its structure, politically, socially, economically, and even culturally. And so there was a level of sophistication within the continent. And there's Sundiata, I forgot to put that in here. But that's the Epic of Old Mali, and it chronicles this particular king and the history of the Malian people. This is the Songhai Empire, which took over the Mali Empire and was actually much larger. You can imagine the level of sophistication involved in maintaining that particular empire. This is the Masai of East Africa. They still live their traditional lifestyles. They were pretty much untouched by Arab influence as well as European influence during the colonial era. And so they still live their traditional lifestyles. You'll see that, this is the typical, this is a ceremony that they're in. So they don't, dress up this much, but they typically wear colored beads, colored cloths. They're still pastoralists. They highly prize their cattle. And you'll see in the background here, that's a mud and dung hut. And they're very proud of their tradition and their lifestyle. They know, they've seen the trappings of the Western world, but they prefer to live their indigenous traditional lifestyle. Here are the Zulu of South Africa. And they actually have a mixture of westernization and traditional lifestyles. They are very proud of their history. If you know anything about their history, you may have heard of Shaka Zulu, the general, the chief, warrior chief who fought very bravely and successfully against British colonization. And as a result, was able to expand his own empire. These are the remains of the Cush Empire in Sudan in East Africa. And as you can see, there's probably influence from Egypt. And these are very sophisticated structures. And they learned, obviously, from the Egyptians how to build these very sophisticated structures. This is even further south in southern Africa. So the influence went all the way down into the southern part of the continent. And these are the great Zimbabwe ruins of the 13th and 15th century. They're still standing. So it obviously reflects the level of sophistication that it took to build these ruins. I mean, they're ruins now, but they were walls to encircle the Zimbabwean empire at the time. And this was built around the 13th and 15th centuries. This is a Phan mosque and its influence on history. Achebe is going to mention this in his essay about Conrad. This is a mask. Some European French artist collected these masks and brought them to Europe, and Pablo Picasso happened to see one of these masks, and he was greatly inspired to create Cubism. And so African art is essentially the gave birth to modern art in the Western world. Here's a Benin bronze from the 1500s. This is actually not of depicting an African, it's depicting the Portuguese explorers who were exploring the western coast of Africa at the time. And if you have time to do sculptures and bronzes and stuff like that, that means you have you probably live in a very sophisticated society that allows you the free time to create art. All right, and moving on. Here we have a pot made from copper. So they were smelting copper and making it into utensils and artifacts, weapons of war, stuff like that. Here you see cloth that they would make into clothing, and mats and blankets and rugs. And we're going to stop there. I'm going to pause here and let you respond in the box below. Any questions or comments or things that you need clarified, go ahead and type that in the box below, and I'll answer as promptly as I can.